Well, it's St. Patrick's Day here at American Vision, which makes it a good time to talk about green things. And I'm here with Dr. Calvin Beisner of the Cornwall Alliance. And the Cornwall Alliance has produced this wonderful series of presentations called Resisting the Green Dragon. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what this product is?
Yeah, Resisting the Green Dragon is a series of lectures by 9 really leading evangelical scholars exposing the anti-Christian worldview, theology, and ethics, the poor science and economics, and the, in many instances, rather dangerous politics of the environmentalist movement, and presenting in contrast a biblical understanding of what it means for humanity to really exercise dominion over the earth. In Genesis 1:28, after God had created Adam and Eve in his own image, he blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, every creeping thing that creeps on the face of the earth." So we are supposed to exercise dominion over the earth. We're supposed to do it in a godly way, a way that glorifies God and that serves and benefits our fellow human beings, really expressing simultaneously the 2 great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So we want people to understand what it means to exercise godly dominion over the earth, which is not going to be destructive, but very much constructive, that will be aimed at causing all the rest of the earth to flourish right along with humanity, but that does recognize that humanity has to have a priority. Human beings alone are created in God's image. Human beings alone have moral consciousness, and therefore it's only of human beings that we can speak in terms of either duty on the one hand or rights on the other hand.
Right.
But much of the environmentalist movement has a very different worldview from this. It really is its own religion to itself, or perhaps we'd better say several different sorts of religions, none of which is really Christianity.
Right.
Most of the environmental movement is of one of 2 types, either secular atheistic on the one hand, no God, matter and energy in motion is all that is, everything got here by blind chance over time through evolution, or it may be more explicitly religious. And of course, secular atheism is itself a religious position. But most people recognize religion when it's some sort of belief in a god or gods or something like that. So most of the environmental movement, not secular atheistic, is instead either pantheist, God is everything.
God is everything.
Or panentheist, God is to the world as the soul is to the human body.
God
inhabits everything, right? Or animist. There are spirits, gods, demons, whatever, that inhabit all the rocks and trees and streams and lakes and everything else. And any one of these, the 3 more spiritualistic environmentalist worldviews, or the 1 more atheistic worldview, any one of those is, of course, contrary to the Christian worldview. And where you start pretty well determines where you're going to wind up in terms of your environmental ethic, your understanding of how the world works, even your understanding of how to interpret scientific data, and on and on. Yeah. So we're trying through this series of lectures to help people see the real contrast between the vast majority of the environmentalist movement and a biblical understanding of human dominion over the earth.
One of the things that I like about Resisting the Green Dragon so much is the fact that when people hear about global warming, they think, oh, this is a scientific issue.
Right.
The scientists will hash this out, and maybe I might have my scientists over against their scientists, but that's something that goes on without me. What this presents so well is that this is a comprehensive, I mean, this deals with politics, economics, it deals with religion and worldview and philosophy. Everything is bound up in this, and that's why it's so dangerous. It is comprehensive.
And even the scientific questions are themselves rooted in more religious, theological worldview issues. For example, when you raise the issue of global warming. Everybody thinks, well, this is just a scientific question. Is the world warming or is it not warming? And does human action contribute to what's going on or does it not? And so on. Well, yes, there are certainly the scientific aspects to that question. We cannot ignore those. But neither can we properly understand them, neither can we properly anticipate so that we can formulate hypotheses that really make sense about the world without a worldview foundation for doing that. Let me see if I can illustrate this for you in a graphic sort of a way. Pretty much all of us have seen film of the airliners crashing into the World Trade Center. And those were pretty big planes, and they were filled with their fuel tanks were filled with jet fuel. And as they crashed into those buildings, you could see the buildings shudder. You could see stuff blown out of the sides of the buildings and all of this thing. And it was horrific. And then we watched for a while as the buildings burned and burned and burned, and then people were jumping out of them and falling through the air. And then we watched in horror as the buildings suddenly collapsed. They just fell right down in on themselves. Now, those were large jetliners that crashed into those buildings. None of us finds it hard to believe that the buildings would collapse after that. But suppose instead the videos had been of a seagull crashing into the side of one of the World Trade Center towers. And the whole tower starts to burn, and then it all collapses. We would say, this is a cartoon. This would not happen. Right? Why do we say that? Because there is something disproportionate between a seagull causing the World Trade Center to collapse and an airliner causing it to collapse. There's something fundamentally disproportionate, and we cannot imagine that an architect would design the World Trade Center towers so that all of their feedback mechanisms would magnify the teeny tiny minuscule impact of a gull against the side of the building so that you had a positive feedback loop and ultimately the whole building collapsed. But that is exactly what the alarmists about global warming are asking us to believe about human emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Absolutely, yeah. Makes sense.
We're told that carbon dioxide has increased since pre-industrial times from around 270 parts per million to about 390 parts per million today. It's heading on upward. It will eventually reach 540 parts per million. That would be a doubling of CO2 content in the atmosphere. Wow, twice as much CO2. This is terrible. And CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It absorbs heat as it bounces from the surface of the Earth back out towards space, and it radiates some of that heat back down toward the surface of the Earth, so it warms the surface of the Earth. Obviously, this has to be contributing to global warming. Now, I don't for a minute deny that rising CO2 must contribute some to warmth on the surface of the Earth. It certainly has to. That's a basic principle in physics. The question is how much? And what people constantly forget is when we go from 270 to 390, or from 270 to 540, we're going parts per million.
Yeah, this is
this means
a doubling of a tiny amount.
That's right. We're being told that an increase of CO2 from 27 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere to 39 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere is going to cause climate catastrophe. Now, if you are an atheistic, secularist, naturalist, and you think the whole Earth and its climate system and everything else got the way it is absolutely by chance, well, you might think that it's really, really fragile and that it could respond to some tiny little perturbation this way. But if you're a Christian, you believe that God made the heavens and the earth, that He designed them, and at the end of Genesis 1, when He looked at all that He made, He said it was very good. You also believe that, as God put it in Genesis 8:21, as long as heaven and earth endure, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. Basically, all of the various cycles on which human life and prosperity and thriving and flourishing depend, God has promised He will sustain.
Yeah.
Now, how can we as Christians seriously entertain the notion that a minute change in atmospheric chemistry, 27 thousandths to 39 thousandths of 1%, is going to cause catastrophe, bringing human civilization into question? I'm sorry.
And for this reason, we need a multinational global government to impose rules on us.
That's right. We need a program that's going to cost trillions of dollars, that is going to cost millions and millions of jobs, that is going to cause energy prices to skyrocket, and particularly, and this is crucial because the Cornwall Alliance, which I head and which produced the Green Dragon series here, the Cornwall Alliance is particularly concerned about the impact of a lot of environmental policy on the poor, because much environmental policy is really quite destructive toward the poor. Well, when we raise the cost of energy, we hurt the poor more than other people because they spend a larger proportion of their income on energy than do middle class and wealthy people.
Right. A $100 electric bill to a poor person is a lot greater burden than it is to someone who's middle class.
And if his electric bill rises from $100 to, say, $120, that hurts him a whole lot more than if a very wealthy person's electric bill rises from, say, $1,000 to $2,000.
Exactly.
A 20% increase for that poor guy is really hard, whereas a doubling for the rich guy, oh, okay, it's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But that's talking just about Americans. I have in mind principally the poor around the world who are indeed so poor, they don't have any electricity at all right now. There are roughly 2 billion people who live this way around the world. No electricity. Their primary heating and cooking fuels are wood and dried dung. These are burned in little open fires in the inside of very poorly ventilated huts. Most of the time, the people in there are the mothers and their children. They breathe the smoke from this stuff. The World Health Organization estimates that somewhere around 2 to 3 million premature deaths every year can be attributed directly to the upper respiratory diseases caused by this stuff, and another several hundred million upper respiratory illnesses that aren't fatal, at least the first time around maybe, but keep people out of work. Now that means that contributes to their ongoing poverty, to their ongoing high rates of disease and premature death. And in order to overcome that, they need electricity. And you know what? Electricity from the filthiest coal-fired electric generating plant would be ever so much better for these people than what they're getting. But the environmentalist movement, frightened of global warming, says, oh, no, 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 we can't have coal-fired generating plants. The cheapest way to provide abundant, reliable electricity to these people, can't have that because that might contribute to global warming. In other words, we have to leave these people without electricity for generations to come, prolonging the period of these 2 to 3 million premature deaths every year and hundreds of millions of debilitating diseases every year.
And when it can be easily solved, but because of an ideological, political, everything else commitment.
That's right.
A worldview commitment, really.
Yes, it is a worldview commitment. It's a worldview commitment that also, if we can sort of shift focus here, it's a worldview commitment that has a fundamental misanthropy, a despising of humanity.
What you're saying reminds me of something that Margaret Thatcher said years ago in Parliament. And one of her famous debates was that one of the guys criticized her that during her campaign, or during her reign, so to speak, the income gap had widened. And her response was, you would rather the poor be poorer, provided that gap was smaller.
Narrower. That's absolutely right. And many socialists and so on think exactly that way. Better that the poor be even poorer than they are than that the rich be as much wealthier than the poor as they are.
Right.
In other words, there's no real care for the poor here. There's an antipathy to the rich.
In the name of caring for the poor.
In the name of caring for the poor, right. But there's a fundamental misanthropy here, because environmentalists start with the assumption that human beings are no different in nature from deer or wolves or amoebas or anything else, any other life form. Maybe there's a quantitative difference in intelligence or something, but there's no qualitative difference between us. And we are fundamentally consumers and polluters.
Right.
We use up the Earth's resources, which assumes they belong to the Earth. The Earth has ownership, right? We use up the Earth's resources, and we poison the Earth while we're at it. And that's essentially all we do. Right. And therefore, as Paul Ehrlich, the author of the book The Population Bomb, puts it, I equals PAT. Environmental impact, which is always negative, always negative. We never do anything good. Nature is always best untouched by human hands.
There's no such thing as cultivation.
That's right, right. Environmental impact equals population times affluence times technology. Yeah. So any increase in any one of those factors, population, affluence, or technology, causes an increase in negative environmental impact. So therefore, we need to reduce the number of people. And we need to reduce the affluence that they enjoy, and we need to reduce their technological level. Consequently, environmentalists see the reduction of human population as a very important thing to do. Well, why would you want, therefore, to prevent 2 to 3 million premature deaths every year from breathing in the smoke of wood and dung? Why would you want to prevent the roughly 4 million deaths every year from malaria that we wiped out in the United States by using cheap, very effective, very safe DDT, but that now Africa, Asia, Latin America are not allowed to use DDT, and so they continue having the malaria-carrying mosquitoes while we don't. You know, if we had 4 million people a year dying of malaria in the United States, we would go back to using DDT in a heartbeat. Yeah. We wouldn't put up with this sort of thing. I have a friend, Paul Dreesen, who's used a particular small school, a mission school in Africa, to illustrate this. The school started out with 50 young people as students at the beginning of one academic year. At the end of the year, there were 18 left.
Oh, goodness.
That's all. All the others were killed by malaria.
Goodness gracious.
If that happened in any school in America, it would be outrage all across this country, and there would be the demand that we stop this.
Absolutely.
But these people are, well,
And I can
for
imagine,
environmentalists, these people are the wrong color, because there's a lot of racism involved here, too.
That's a whole, I mean, you're bringing up a whole range of issues we could talk forever about. But one more second on the DDT issue, because I assume that even a lot of people listening to this who are Christians and conservatives hear DDT, and it's like, whoa, that stuff poisons eagles' eggs and kills.
Yeah, well, the fact is that at pretty high doses, you can detect some thinning of the eggshells of birds that have this, and especially at the upper end of the food chain, the raptors, eagles, and the like, there was some thinning of their eggshells. However, interestingly enough, there was never indication that there was a lower survival rate of the young from these birds than for the birds that were not affected by DDT. In fact, DDT turns out to have been extremely safe. Now, I don't doubt that Rachel Carson, when she published Silent Spring in 1963, really believed that DDT was a threat to birds. I think she certainly used some hyperbole when she predicted that because of DDT we would come to a time when there would be a silent spring, there'd be no birds around, we wouldn't hear the songs of birds. But I really think she believed it. Yeah. The truth was, though, that once we had had the time to do the scientific studies, to do the correlative studies over long periods of time, we found that there was no significant risk from DDT. There was certainly never any risk to human beings. DDT is utterly inert in human tissue. And in fact, one of the scientists who went around campaigning against the ban on DDT would take spoonfuls of it and eat it on stage in front of people. He never was hurt. Yeah. He lived to a ripe old age.
It's a great trick.
So DDT is a very safe, and it is the least expensive chemical. And indeed, it doesn't have to be used prolifically as we did it here in the United States, literally spraying it from airplanes over vast stretches of land. Instead, you can spray a very light spray of DDT on the interior walls of homes in areas that still have malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Twice a year, you present zero risk to the surrounding environment, zero risk to the human inhabitants, but it will stop those mosquitoes dead in their tracks. If they land on it, they die. If they fly into the home, they lose their orientation, they get confused, they can't bite. So you stop the spread of malaria very easily. That's cheap. Mosquito nets are more expensive and very, very ineffective.
Yeah, and they have to be used constantly.
Right, they have to be used constantly, and they're very uncomfortable. Ever try sleeping under a mosquito net?
Well, I can imagine.
It's miserable.
But, you know, God forbid you fall asleep on the couch one night. Assuming these people have couches.
Right,
the point is,
or fall asleep on the dirt floor.
on the floor, yeah, one night.
While you're not reading your book because you don't have electricity for a light and your candle is too dim.
Yeah.
So you can't get a good education to rise out of poverty.
And
all of these things tie together. You know?
and that's what I love about this, is you show that this is not just a political issue. It's a worldview. It's a Christian issue. And if you're not,
that's right.
Now, one thing about this, you quoted the Dominion Mandate verse at the beginning of this
Genesis
discussion.
1:28.
Absolutely. And you also talk about how the liberals and the people pushing the green agenda will say that we believe in basically bulldozing creation and the environment.
That's nonsense.
We're anti. I remember in college, in my undergraduate, one of my professors quoting that verse to me and saying, "This is what the Christian Western ethic has done to society because of that." Because of that.
Yeah. All that really came out of an article published in Science magazine in 1967 by Lynn White, Jr. The article was the religious roots of our ecological crisis, I think was the title of the article. It's been reprinted hundreds of times. And Lynn White, Jr. Said that Judeo-Christian religion, Abrahamic religion, monotheistic religion, because of this verse, had promoted an attitude of humanity toward the earth that was exploitative, that was destructive, that said we can just manipulate it any way we want with no sense of accountability or responsibility whatsoever. You know what? You can go back through generations and generations and generations, millennia of Jewish and Christian writing, and never find anybody interpreting that verse that way.
Yeah.
You will instead find Christian and Jewish rabbis and theologians through the generations writing about how what this teaches us is a reverence for God's expression of His creative power and genius in the world around us, and a responsibility for us to go out and use that in a way that really magnifies God's creative work.
Yeah.
In its context, you know, Genesis 1:28 comes at the end of the creation story in Genesis 1. God has shown Himself to be a creative, wise, righteous person who loves to cause life to proliferate. He just, you know, he makes all these kinds of life, and He tells them all to be fruitful and multiply. He loves life, right? And we're made in His image to be like Him. We're supposed to be the same way. That's what informs this. Now, in the very next chapter, we narrow in on a smaller place, part of the earth, the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
And God places Adam in the Garden of Eden, and He tells him there in Genesis 2:15 that he is to cultivate and guard the garden. Now, if we put these two together, 1:28, by the way, was spoken after God had already made Eve.
Right.
Before that, He had said 2:15, cultivate and guard the garden. Okay?
True.
So the sequence there is Adam is placed in the garden. He's told to cultivate and guard that. Then he gets his mate, Eve, and then he and she together are told to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? The big picture is this. Adam and Eve, when she joins him, are to start in the garden, cultivate it. Now, the garden is already paradisaical.
Yeah.
It is, in fact, as we learn from the rest of Scripture, symbolic of the tabernacle, the temple, the very presence of God. This is where we commune with God in this beautiful paradise.
Yeah.
And we end up at the end of the book of Revelation
22,
also in a garden paradise, but this garden paradise is also a city.
Yeah.
We start in the Bible in a garden, we end in a garden city, right? It's paradise in both instances. It is full of life in both instances. The tree of life is there in both instances. Adam is to start in the garden, and then he is to go out from the garden, multiplying his race, and subdue and rule the rest of the earth, which means that prior to that, the rest of the earth has not been subdued and ruled.
Right.
It is the place of potential where Adam is to work out this imago Dei in him. And what's really interesting is that a number of times in the rest of the Bible, wilderness is described as associated with the curse of God, and the phrase without form and void is used to describe that.
Yeah.
Well, that's the same phrase that in the very beginning of the story of creation is used to describe the earth prior to God's bringing in light and separating land from water and starting up all the forms of life. So the earth began largely without form and void. Wilderness reflects that. So what Adam is supposed to do is to go from the Garden of Eden, which is formed and filled, out into the wilderness, which is without form and void by comparison, not absolutely, but by comparison. He is to make it more formed and filled.
And I always loved the image of the river flowing out of Eden.
Yes.
And then into four heads.
Watering all the
It's almost as if God was saying, come on, follow, and then take this out into the entire world and make it fruitful and multiply.
This is why it is so tragic, first of all, that somebody like Lynn White could so thoroughly misunderstand Genesis and could make this charge with zero historical evidence that any Jewish or Christian writers on Genesis had ever taken it the way he said Christianity is done. But it's also so sad that hardly any Christian scholars had any significant rebuttal to this for roughly 30 years after that. In fact, we could almost say exactly 30 years. I'm not aware of any Christian scholar, and I've read very widely in Christian writings on environmental stuff. I'm not aware of any Christian scholar who head-on refuted White's claims about this until my own book, exactly 30 years later, called Where Garden Meets Wilderness, where I set forth this way of understanding this.
That's crazy. And that goes back to what I'm talking about. Christians view those things as somehow outside of the Christian worldview, or what they do as Christians. And this does such a great job of tying everything together. It's God's creation. We're His image. We are,
we're His representatives on the earth.
Absolutely. And subduing and taking dominion does not mean bulldozing and putting everything in chains and shackles.
It certainly doesn't mean paving over the whole earth with Walmart parking lots.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, so this is a great discussion. I find all this stuff fascinating, and we could go on for another probably 2 hours and let you talk about these things. But I sure appreciate you taking your time today
Joel,
to discuss this with. And the DVD is Resisting the Green Dragon. I highly recommend it. 12 wonderful 30-minute lectures can be used for Sunday schools, perfect for Sunday schools, home schools, and everything else. I highly recommend it. Thank you.
Well, thank you.